Hi, everyone, and welcome. I am joined today by Anatol Lieven, a former professor at Georgetown and currently the director of the Eurasia program at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Excellent publication. I guess the big story is the diplomacy is slowly moving forward. I guess many people initially with this ceasefire proposal expected, at least in Europe, that this would be some kind of a take it or leave it deal for Russia. But then we saw when Trump hinted that they would talk about territory and power plants, that this, of course, was more about a final peace deal as opposed to only a ceasefire. However, they already held the phone call now, and I want to get your perspective on this. What is the diplomatic path you're seeing here, or how do you make sense of this?
I think the peace process is moving forward slowly, but it was always going to be slow. Um, I mean, I don't know if Trump himself believed that, he could solve this in 24 hours, but certainly I don't think anybody else did. Um, and it would have been extremely unusual if, in a phone call of this kind, they sorted out all these extremely complex issues, which of course then, after all, have to be presented to the Ukrainians for their agreement as well. But the the agreement to end for both sides to end attacks on energy infrastructure is, I think, quite significant. It's uh, an important concession by the Russians. They have made, knocking to pieces Ukraine's energy infrastructure a key part of their strategy, um, you know, since the first months of the war. Um, and, it's an area where they have huge advantage and where they can do immense damage to the Ukrainian economy and have done immense damage. Whereas, Ukrainian attacks on Russia, though significant, have been far, far less damaging. So Russia has given up a certain advantage, um, and has not actually got anything in return so far, except that, I suppose a measure of goodwill, um, from Trump and, the commitment from the Americans to go on, working for a peace settlement. Uh, the Russian position now, of course, the Americans did not get a total ceasefire on the ground as well. Now, the Russians, of course, had rejected that because on the ground they now have really significant advantages. And, as their latest victory in Kursk shows, um, you know, time is on their side. So obviously they're not going to give up their biggest point of pressure on the Ukrainians unless, as the Russians have demanded, and which is now where we are. Firstly, certain things are nailed down. Certain, agreements are reached in advance, at least in outline. And secondly, if Russia is going to give up its military advantage on the ground, then Ukraine has to give up something in return. And what the Russians are demanding, of course, is that the Ukrainians, that the West cease supplying Ukraine with arms and intelligence during the ceasefire period. Which, of course, has not been acceptable, and in fact, which the Trump administration can't deliver because there's the European aspect, aspect as well. So, you know, it's moved a step further. We don't know the details of, what, what they, uh, may have talked about. I mean, some things I think are becoming clear gradually. Um, uh, the Ukrainians will not recover the territory that they've lost. That won't mean, Ukrainian recognition of this lost territory, but they can't get it back militarily. I think it's unless the Russians can win, a crushing military victory in the coming weeks or months, the Russians will not gain, massive additional territory that the Ukrainians still hold. And the eventual ceasefire will be wherever the battle line stops. Um, and then, I mean, the key aspect of this, which the latest, statement after this talk hinted at, is that, in return for a a radically new relationship with the United States, in which the US basically ends its pressure on Russia on a whole set of points, and of course ends sanctions, that Russia in return would drop its unacceptable conditions vis-a-vis Ukraine. Um, because, while there are some conditions the Ukrainians will have to agree to, and many of which are not actually up to the Ukrainians, like NATO membership, um, there are others that no Ukrainian government can agree to. I mean, they cannot agree to withdraw from territory that they still hold, and they can't agree to disarm, um, which was at least a Russian demand in the past. I mean, certain arms limitations, perhaps, but not disarmament. So we'll have to see. That's what this process is about. There is, however, one colossal problem from a Russian point of view, uh, and that's called US elections. Um, as a Russian commentator remarked to me a few weeks ago, the problem about doing any deal with America is that it can't be guaranteed for more than 4 years maximum, because in 2028 the Democrats win, and then just tear the whole thing up and we're back to square one. So the Russians want, that's why they want to make any peace settlement as concrete, detailed, and formal as they possibly can. Now, the thing is, though, that this is why the Russians very much want something, signed under the United Nations. But you see, the problem as well is that, for an actual treaty to be signed between America and Russia, two-thirds of the Senate has to vote for it. Now, in the mood the Democrats are, they will never agree to anything proposed by Trump. And therefore, you won't have a US-Russian treaty. You will have something much, vaguer and more provisional than that. And, that, in my view, very understandably, that is a problem for Moscow, at least when it comes to, making concessions. Because there is a feeling, in the Russian establishment that we give up something concrete and permanent, and in return, we get something with a shelf life of maybe no more than 3 years and a bit.
Yeah, and of course, there's been all this. Yeah, the biggest fear I think of the Russians is to walk into another Minsk agreement. But the Minsk agreement was also approved in the under Resolution 2022, so it was also binding by international law, but it didn't do any good. I did
Exactly.
want, but I did want to ask about what does the foundation of a peace agreement have to look like, and to what extent does it be complicated? I guess in terms of getting the Ukrainians and also the Europeans on board, because the Ukrainians are quite reluctant to accept a lot of things. But as you mentioned, the issue of NATO expansion is they don't really have a say. The territorial concessions, they could always just say that they don't recognize it, but make their peace with reality. And I guess the last would be the security guarantees. They can't demand security guarantees from the US either. So I'm not sure how much they have to say. And in addition, with Trump possibly putting some more pressure on Zelensky's legitimacy, The Ukrainians could always be pressured, but the Europeans, they are quite hostile. And well, if listening to the rhetoric of the British and French, especially, what would the foundations of a peace agreement look like if there's a need to also get the Europeans on board?
Well, I mean, the Europeans, their key role is to offer Ukraine a minimally credible path towards membership of the European Union, and more concretely, to offer a really substantial package for Ukrainian reconstruction. And that would have to be almost certainly also worked out with Russia because there's, all this talk of um, using, seizing the 300 billion in Russian assets for this. Well, that could be agreed if it's paid into a joint fund and, with equivalent sums from the European Union, and a considerable chunk of the Russian share goes to reconstruct the Russian-held areas of Ukraine. I mean, all this, but that's the biggest thing that the Europeans have to offer, really. It's reconstruction and a path to the EU, which, by the way, Russia has agreed to. But Russians have said publicly that's that's the sovereign right of Ukraine to join the EU. My own view, cynical view, is that that's because they think it will never happen. But anyway, they have said that they they have no objection to it. But my fear is, you see, that um, this European proposal, which Starmer and Macron are still going on about, for a European peacekeeping force of tens of thousands of troops in Ukraine as part of a peace settlement or after a peace settlement, with or without Russian agreement, that is not going to happen. The Russians will reject it. Starmer has said it can't happen without a US backstop and guarantee, which Trump will not give. But, of course, by keeping it on the table, the Europeans could encourage the Ukrainians, to keep pressing for that, thereby to delay and delay and delay a peace settlement uh, until, well, various things could happen. The Russians will never agree to it. So, but maybe the Russians, in return for it being given up, make some concession in a different area, when it comes to Ukrainian, you know, arms limitation, for example, or changes to the Ukrainian constitution. That's one possibility. Um, Another possibility is that it it's left off the table. I mean, it's isn't introduced into the peace settlement, but it isn't excluded from the peace settlement, and the Ukrainians keep trying to reintroduce them later. Well, that's a recipe for catastrophe. It's a recipe for the war resuming. A third possibility is that this will annoy Trump so much that he'll finally say, look, I've told you again and again this isn't going to happen. Okay, Europeans and Ukrainians, you want to go ahead, continue this war, but without America, and that he, reintroduces the halt to American arms and intelligence, which would leave Ukraine and Europe in a very difficult position. But of course, the final possibility is that this spins out the war and spins out the war until the Ukrainian army collapses. The chances of that we just don't know. I mean, over the past year, Russia has been advancing, but very, very slowly. And we don't know how heavy the casualties are because you certainly can't trust Western intelligence estimates. Um, but sorry, this is an appalling cliche, but war is by definition a chancy business. And as various people have pointed out, in the First World War on the Western Front, you had a stalemate lasting for 3 years, followed by collapse. And if either side collapses, it's not going to be the Russians. And that's why um, I think that this European approach is malignantly stupid as far as the interests of Ukraine are concerned.
No, I agree. I think well, doesn't make any sense. And indeed, even in Britain, the media's turning a bit on Starmer because the rhetoric is coming out with this very belligerent ideas that they would send troops, which they don't really have, which they can't send without American protection, which America doesn't want to give. And it's very unclear to me what the purpose is, if it's to sabotage some of the talks or if it's to elevate Britain's relevance within Europe, given that it's losing its somewhat connection to the US. Is it intended to give the Europeans a say in the peace negotiations? It's just, or do they really want to go fight the Russians? I mean, this is no, I would like to shake my head on this as well, but the rhetoric has become quite absurd, I guess.
Well, I mean, it's all these things, but I think there's one other aspect. Um, for years and years and years and years, the Western establishment, media and think tanks and so forth, totally wrongly, in my view, went on and on about how, oh, Putin isn't really interested in defending Russian national interests, or, he's not a Russian nationalist. He's not really interested in Ukraine. He doesn't really worry about NATO. No, no, this is all about, Putin trying to maintain domestic authority and domestic popularity and legitimacy and so forth and so on. Well, I don't think that was true of Putin. I'm absolutely sure that it's true of Starmer and Macron. I mean, Macron is, as everyone has said, is a lame duck. He's politically bankrupt. He has no majority in parliament. He can only get things done by decree. Um, but he has another 2.5 years to run. Starmer, bizarrely enough, although he has a huge majority in parliament, he gained it because of the bizarre nature of the British electoral system, with less than a third of the popular vote. And until a few weeks ago, he was regarded, as a kind of lame duck before he'd even come out of the egg, if you see what I mean. His government was regarded as bankrupt of ideas, intellectually vacuous, and so forth and so on. And of course, Macron, there is an element of what do they call it? Cosplay, costume play about this.
Mm.
Macron's dressed up as de Gaulle, Starmer's dressed up as a sort of cut price Winston Churchill. And they're trying, with, I'm sorry to say, the acquiescence of chunks at least of the French and British media. They're trying to play the role of great national leaders confronted, with the modern equivalent of Adolf Hitler. Um, uh,
But what is the, of course, a key criticism of Minsk agreement was always that, it was only an agreement between Kiev and Donbass. And the Europeans wanted to get more recognition that Russia was a participant, although it didn't appear in the document. But I thought it was a fair criticism that it was both a domestic conflict, but also it had international partners. I think where the West got it wrong was it's not just Russia, the NATO was involved too. But given that this is represents more or less a fragmentation, or if not a complete collapse of the European security architecture attempted to be established after the Cold War, that is a Europe without Russia. Um, Macron himself had suggested at times that this is something that it can't be stable, that is more or less, that Europe without Russia would become a Europe against Russia. So what has gone wrong with with Europe then over the past 30 years? And again, it becomes a big question, but what can be done to fix this?
well, I mean, the thing is that, if, and of course, France is less powerful than it was under de Gaulle. Though then again, de Gaulle famously said that, so much of his international strategy was based on bluff. He was bluffing, about France having power that it didn't really have. But the thing is, de Gaulle in these circumstances, you remember how de Gaulle blocked British. membership of the EU. J'ai dit non. I have said no. He didn't consult with the European Union. He didn't consult with Adenauer, let alone, the Dutch or the Belgians or the Andorrans or whoever. He just said, from the point of view of France, this is not, you know, our conception of the EU. It is not in the interests of France, and I will not allow it, period. Now, Macron has never been willing to do this, partly because you've had two doctrines have grown up in the French foreign and security establishment. The first, going back a long way, is that France can only operate now if it leads the European Union. But of course, especially since the East Europeans came on board, that might still have been possible in the 1990s. But now it's not because, the Poles and the Balts, backed up by the Swedes and others, will block it if it comes to an independent, a new policy towards Russia or Ukraine. But the second thing is that, for reasons I still don't really understand, um, so much of the French establishment has become almost British, or was until Trump came along, in its subservience to the United States. Possibly simply because, uh, you know, maybe I don't know what it is, but well, I suppose it's just that, under de Gaulle, um, I can't. De Gaulle must have been to America. But except for, the French, some French intellectuals or the ones, the people who ended up in America as a result of the Second World War, very, 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 very few French people, including members of the elite, um, had ever set foot in America. Clemenceau didn't. Um, yeah, I mean, whereas of course now you have a situation in which all the leading figures in certainly in the French think tank world and in the French financial world and so forth, very much like their British equivalents. Part of their cursus honorum has been to spend years in New York or Washington. And it's sort of bred a culture of deference to the United States, which de Gaulle would have found, frankly, absolutely abominable. Um, but as a result, I mean, the problem about Macron is not just that he engages in cosplay, but it's his costume changes, almost sometimes on a weekly basis. So, yes, I mean, he talks about how Russia has to be part of European security, but if he had been consistent about that, he would have thrown his full weight behind the Minsk process and he would have come out and said, look, the first step has to be Ukraine. We cannot get anywhere until the Ukrainian parliament passes with a time deferral. Sure, absolutely. But it has to pass a constitutional amendment guaranteeing the autonomy of the Donbass. Until that is done, there simply isn't a step forward. Now, of course, that autonomy kicks in when Russian troops leave and so forth, but it has to be there. But he was never willing to do that. It was already apparent years before the war that Ukraine couldn't be a member of NATO, because nobody was going to go to war to defend Ukraine. Um, I still think that if Macron had come out, before the war and said, and he told Zelensky, as Zelensky has said in public, that Ukraine will not be a member of NATO within whatever Zelensky asked, 5 years. But if Macron had come out and said, look, we must face it, Ukraine will never be a member of NATO. I therefore will veto any proposal that it be a member of NATO, and we must talk about other guarantees. I don't think that at that point Putin would have invaded Ukraine because that would have opened up such opportunities, precisely for a new European security architecture. But what did Macron actually do? He went to Moscow and he spent how many hours it was talking to Putin in terms of generalities about new atmospheres. And so I've, talked to people who were listening into that. And he could not be pinned down to anything concrete, not on Minsk, not on NATO, not on, lifting sanctions over Crimea and so forth. So, I mean, the point is, you've actually got to offer something concrete, and you've also got to not offer concrete things. I mean, if Macron thinks that, including Russia in a new version of European security, is compatible, with a French army in Ukraine. Um, you know, I mean, I wouldn't employ him to sell, onions at Disneyland.
Well, I think it's going to be difficult to get something based on the Helsinki Accord, something of a Gorbachev common European home style. But on the other hand, the whole premise of having NATO as some manifestation of a collective hegemon in Europe, it seems to be well, not falling apart necessarily, but what we see or what's reasonable to expect in a multipolar world that the interest that the Europeans and Americans have would diverge more as opposed to a unipolar or a bipolar world where the interests were more or less pushed together. So, given that the US already has less resources and other priorities, I guess some of the shock, of course, comes now with Trump's statements, and the Europeans now think they have to learn to live on their own. I think, yeah, some of this will probably calm down, but the wider developments, given that this collective hegemon in Europe is no longer a possibility, do you see any opportunities to yeah, again, again, not Gorbachev's common European home, but something at least that builds a bit more on the Charter of Paris for a new Europe, something about indivisible security, Europe without dividing lines. I know it's difficult with to get a consensus across the entire bloc, given, as you mentioned, the Baltics, Poland, increasingly the Scandinavians are quite aggressive, uh, but when the status quo unravels, something else has to replace it.
Well, I mean, I think the answer or question is, which Europeans and which Americans. And I mean, this is not something that I say with great happiness and so forth, but it's clear, it's absolutely clear from Vance's remarks in Munich what he's looking forward to or hoping for. And this is a situation whereby, by 2029, you have in America President Vance, you have in Paris, in France, President Le Pen or President Bardella. Putin is still there in Russia, presumably, or an appointed successor to Putin. You have Orban in Hungary. I mean, given what's happening in Romania, I mean, I don't think you might be able to knock out Georgescu, but you won't be able to knock out the sort of populist wing for there. Meloni has tacked, to the European centre because, of course, Italy is too weak to stand up against a combination of France and Germany. But if France and Germany radically split, then I think Meloni will go with the, with well, I mean, that was ideologically inclined with France, with Le Pen, and then of course you've got the Spanish and Portuguese who don't give a damn one way or the other, but will vote with the majority, and then of course you have ideologically speaking a very different Europe. Now, how that will work out in terms of uh, relations with the Poles and the Balts and so forth is very difficult to say. But of course, there is the the possibility of one absolutely supreme irony, um, which would be really somewhat tragic for the Poles and Balts, except that they have totally brought it on themselves, as always happens in the best tragedies. Who knows? It's essentially, the fault of the protagonist or victim, which is, um, if they push and push and push, and America pushes and everyone pushes for Ukraine to join the European Union, and this is certainly something which the Ukrainians will really want as compensation for not getting into NATO. It is virtually impossible to see how that can happen with the European Union in its present form. So what you might get is, I mean, either Ukraine with so many opt-outs or cutouts or carve-outs or whatever that it is a permanent third-class citizen. Or, of course, if the European Union runs into another really deep economic crisis, that the European Union will split. So many people have talked about a two-speed Europe, and then Ukraine can be brought into the second or the third tier. But the tragic thing for the Poles and the Balts, of course, is that they will end up with the Ukrainians in the second or third tier as well, which, as I say, one could feel sorry for them, except that they would have brought it totally on themselves.
Well, this is a thing. If Ukraine is fought to the last, Ukrainian is also fought to the last euro, it seems, because the economies of Europe are really struggling, and now, as they're at their weakest, this idea of pumping hundreds of billions of euros into armament, it seems quite foolish when we have real problems with the industrialization, and I don't think a weapons industry is going to be able to reverse this. So yeah, there is this economic aspect which might cause the downfall of Europe. Probably that would be the main one. However, just as my final question, because you touched on this, the populist uprising, and there is an interesting division emerging because after the Cold War, we kind of all the West or political West came together with this idea that the world was divided between liberal democracy and authoritarianism. This was kind of the lens to understand the world as divided between the superiors and the inferiors. But with this, I guess, decoupling of the liberals from the conservatives, or the or the liberalism from the nation state, we've seen this new on the political right, this new vision. I mean, Samuel Huntington, he outlined it in Dead Souls in 2004 when he said that the real division in Europe, in America, will be between the cosmopolitans and the nationalists. And
Mm.
this very much will summarizes very well what's what we now refer to as the populists on the right, which is they see themselves as patriots, nationalists, while they see that their main opponents are the globalists, the cosmopolitans, and this is and through this division, it doesn't. This it's interesting because Russia suddenly shifts immediately. Instead of being the main adversary, it can become a key partner. So how how do you see this contributing to unraveling Europe? Because whatever conflict tensions there is in the US, we have the same in Europe. When we're talking about what does it mean to be European, we have completely different understanding. And for example, when you
Mm.
have mass migration, as you had from 2015, this really comes to the forefront. Because for the Germans, they say, oh, to be a good European is to be liberal, take in the migrants and embrace them, human rights. This is what Europe is. For the Hungarians and the Poles, they said, no, no, being European means to, preserving our Christian heritage, being able to reproduce our own culture. So completely separate. And some
Mm.
political issues, of course, split them even more. But how do you see this contributing to fragment, or do you see this can be tempered in some way?
Well, I mean, it's very interesting, that as I say, Vance's speech in Munich was portrayed as being anti-European. But it wasn't. It was very much anti the existing European establishments. But he was clearly reaching out to the European right-wing populist oppositions. And, Vance, Catholic convert, uh, quotes Thomas Aquinas and St. Augustine and looks back to Rerum Novarum. I mean, he is, I mean, we know where he would be in France or, who he would be running for or, which party. Um, so yes, I mean that's the thing. I mean, though on this Huntington, in a way contradicted himself because he sort of posited these great civilizational blocks, but actually it's internal in Europe and in and in America. Um, but there is, of course, one fascinating twist, which is that, and here, the a lot of the rhetoric of the European Union and the whatever you want to call them, the European cosmopolitans, is quite wrong. There are, well, three twists. First of all, this is not straightforwardly racist anymore. I mean, in a way, it's much more Russian. Uh, you know, you think of the old European racists, they looked down on everybody who wasn't white. Um, in Russia, it's always been quite different. There are Asiatic peoples you regard as friends and you intermarry with, and they join the Russian elites, and going back 1,000 years, for God's sake. And there are others who you regard as enemies. The Tatars are now allies. The Chechens, well, at least during the Chechen wars, were enemies. Well, you cannot portray not merely Vance, but also Alice Weigel in Germany. They're not racists in any traditional sense. Vance is married to an Indian, and Weigel is gay, partnered with a Sri Lankan woman, for God's sake. I mean, this is really not, old style white racism. Um, but then, yes, they have problems with other categories of, non-Europeans, put it that way. So that's the first thing. We're living in a much, much, much more complex world. In Britain, the most, anti-illegal immigrant politicians in recent years have been Hindus, and actually now a Nigerian who, Kemi Badenoch, who, when asked why, she says, "Look, my parents came in legally, but also I know a bit about what it's like in West Africa, and no, I don't want Britain to become like that." So it's complex from that point of view. But the other thing, of course, and this is where the whole Nazi allegation goes wildly, wildly astray, is that it's not Le Pen and AfD and company in Europe who are the militarists. Absolutely not. They don't give a damn about combating Russia, about expanding democracy by force, about intervention here or whatever. No, all they really care about is defending the borders of Europe against migration. But so I mean, the whole set of reasons why AfD is not Nazi, but biggest single one. And of course, none of them, nobody, the European Union could break up, and still the Germans are not going to attack France in order to get Alsace-Lorraine back, or attack Poland in order to, recover Silesia. So that's out. But also, um, AfD, are they Nazis? No. Do they dream of Lebensraum, of going to war with Russia to conquer land for Germany's excess population? No, no, absolutely not. I almost have a suspicion that a lot of this hostility, certainly on the part of the European foreign and security establishments, to Le Pen and still more AfD would go away if only they were much more militarist and anti-Russian. If they would sign up to an aggressive program of rolling back Russia and expanding white bracket European civilization at the expense of the Asiatic bracket Russian Oriental barbarians, I think they would be much more acceptable to a lot of think tanks in Germany, despite the fact that it would, of course, make them much, much, much more like the Nazis. So it's getting very complicated and has, by now multiple layers of irony involved as well.
It does appear sometimes history, well, if not to repeat itself, rhymes because we yeah, we've done all of this in the past. I mean, if there's going to be some rivalry, not militaristic in Europe, it would be the British and the French as they competed a bit before the Napoleonic War. But this time, who should lead Europe? And also, it's interesting that in the 19th century, you had many Europeans, and especially Germans, who during industrialization felt that they lost something behind about yeah, traditional Europe. So conservatism, not about not changing anything, but managing change. A lot of
Yeah.
them went to Russia and well, effectively to yeah, to rediscover some of the things that were being lost as the Russians had fallen behind on industrialization. Now it's shifted a bit. Now
Yeah.
they're looking towards Russia and the conservatives, people like Salvini show up and saying, "Oh, I feel a bit more home here than I do in Italy because they preserved, they're able to reproduce their traditional European culture while we're not able to do it in Italy." So it is. It's not nationalist to the extent that it's limited to only reproducing their own culture, but
Mm.
indeed some European solidarity that they're seeing other Europeans reproduce their culture and yeah, they define some, I guess, not alliance, but solidarity in their conservative ideas. But again, conservatism isn't universalism; it's about reproducing your distinctiveness. So it does, yeah, it does become confusing
But
territory, I guess.
but of course, liberalism is only universalist in the sense that they want liberalism to be universalist. Nor, of course, historically is liberalism anti-militarist if you go back far enough. Just while you were speaking, I recalled something that happened during the um, European revolutions of 1848, when the liberals had this German assembly parliament at the Paulskirche in Frankfurt, and a delegation of German liberals went from there to um, to see the King of Prussia, one of the God, I get them all mixed up, Wilhelm or Friedrich Wilhelm or one of them. Anyway, and I think they were led by one of the von Gerlachs, this delegation. And they urged the King of Prussia to unify Germany and, of course, do what Bismarck later did, but in a different way, and exclude the Austrians, by declaring war on Russia. And the King of Prussia said, "But why would I do that? We've just been allies of the Russians against those, wicked French. The Russians have never done any harm to me or Germany. They played a critical role in liberating us in 1813. What possible excuse, what legitimate reason do I have to go to war with Russia?" And the liberals, pretty unwisely, it's not how you talk to a king. The head of the delegation said, "Well, in that case, Your Majesty, since you have refused to unify Germany in the name of this crusade against Russian barbarism, I regard Germany as doomed," and stormed out. Who was the militarist there? The king in his guards uniform, or all these liberals in their frock coats.
Well, this is I guess liberalism always had a bit of a military wing to it. Also true from Woodrow Wilson's time, when you take a country from being a beacon of democracy to be emulated to going on a civilizing mission, it is a fine line to be crossed, I guess. Anyways, I think I've already taken way too much of your time. So, Anatol, even I thank you so much for your time. I do appreciate
A
it.
pleasure as always.